That night, everything in Keanu Reeves' life changed forever, but no one knew it yet. On the 47th floor of the luxury hotel in Tokyo, as the city lights illuminated his face, Keanu stared at the photograph in his hands. Seeing the person in that photograph had stirred something in him he'd never felt before. But what was truly shocking was how this photograph had found its way to him. Hours earlier, he had wrapped filming on John Wick 5. The crew had dispersed. As always, he had quietly retreated to his room, trying to shake off the day's exhaustion. That's when his door was knocked. When he opened it, he found an elderly Japanese woman he'd never seen before, standing in the hallway. "Reeves-san," the woman had said, her English heavily accented but clear, "I have something that belongs to you." Before he could respond, she placed a worn envelope in his hands and walked away without another word. By the time he looked up from the envelope, she had vanished down the corridor as if she'd never been there at all. Inside the envelope was the photograph, and a note that would haunt him for the rest of the night. But what was written on that note? And who was the person in the photograph that could make Hollywood's most composed actor tremble? The photograph showed a man Keanu had never met, yet somehow recognized. The stranger's eyes held a familiarity that cut through decades of carefully constructed emotional walls. Written on the back, in handwriting that seemed ancient yet urgent, were 5 words that would unravel everything Keanu thought he knew about his past. "Your father wants to meet you." Keanu's hands shook as he read those words again and again. His father had abandoned him when he was 3 years old. For 58 years, there had been no contact, no explanation, no closure. He had built his entire life around that absence, crafting characters who embodied the stoic strength of men who needed no one. But now, this photograph suggested something impossible. His father was alive. Not only alive, but actively searching for him. The note continued with an address in Kyoto and a time, tomorrow, 3 p.m., come alone. As Keanu stood in his hotel room, Tokyo glittering endlessly below, he faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could ignore the note, dismiss it as an elaborate hoax, and continue living with the familiar pain of abandonment. Or he could take a leap into the unknown and confront the ghosts that had shaped every role he'd ever played. What he didn't know was that this decision would lead him to discover a truth so profound, it would change not just his understanding of his past, but his entire approach to human connection. The clock on his bedside table read 11:47 p.m. In 15 hours and 13 minutes, he would either meet his father for the first time in over half a century or walk away from the biggest mystery of his life. But first, he had to survive the longest night of his life. The sleepless hours that followed were filled with memories Keanu had spent decades trying to suppress. He found himself pacing the hotel room, the photograph clutched in one hand, his phone in the other. 3 times he started to call his sister Kim. 3 times he stopped. How do you tell someone that the father who destroyed your family might be reaching out after 58 years of silence? At 2:33 a.m., unable to bear the confined space any longer, Keanu slipped out of the hotel. Tokyo at night was a different creature entirely. Neon dragons breathing life into empty streets, the distant hum of trains carrying night shift workers to their destinations. He walked aimlessly, hoping the movement would quiet the storm in his mind. But what he discovered during that walk would prove even more unsettling. As he passed a 24-hour internet cafe, something compelled him to go inside. For the first time in years, he Googled his father's name, Samuel Nowlin Reeves Jr. What appeared on the screen made his blood run cold. The search results showed recent activity. His father wasn't just alive, he was thriving. Articles from the past year showed him involved in environmental conservation work in British Columbia. But more shocking were the quotes attributed to him in these articles. "I've spent my life running from my greatest mistake," his father had told a Vancouver journalist just 6 months earlier. "Abandoning my children was the cowardice of a young man who thought adventure was more important than responsibility. I've been trying to find the courage to reach out to my son for decades." Keanu's hands trembled as he scrolled through more articles. His father had been sober for 30 years. He'd dedicated his life to helping indigenous communities protect their land. He'd never remarried, never had other children. And in every interview, he mentioned Keanu. "I watch every film my son makes," his father had said in another article. "I see in his performances a depth of understanding about loss and redemption that I fear I gave him too early. He's become the man I never was." But the most devastating discovery was yet to come. Hidden in the environmental blog post from last year was a single paragraph that shattered everything Keanu thought he knew about his childhood. Samuel Reeves quietly funds a scholarship program for children of single mothers. paying for their education and emotional support services. When asked why this cause is important to him, Reeves explains that he left his wife and children not out of selfishness, but because he was battling severe mental illness and addiction. "I thought they were better off without me," he says. "I was wrong, but by the time I got help, I was too ashamed to return, too afraid I'd cause more damage." Keanu stared at the screen until his eyes burned. The story he'd told himself for 5 decades, that his father was a selfish man who chose freedom over family, crumbled in an instant. His father had been sick. His father had been trying to protect them. As dawn broke over Tokyo, Keanu made a decision that terrified him more than any death-defying stunt he'd ever performed. He would go to Kyoto. He would meet the man whose absence had defined his life. But first, he needed to understand something else. How had that woman known exactly where to find him? How had she known about his private pain? The answer came from an unexpected source. As he walked back to his hotel, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown Japanese number. "Mr. Reeves, forgive the intrusion. I am Hiroshi Tanaka, your father's friend. He has been in Japan receiving treatment for late-stage lung cancer. The woman who brought you the photograph was my mother. She insisted on being the one to deliver his message because she said you would need to see sincerity, not desperation. Your father doesn't know I'm texting you. He made me promise to respect your choice if you decided not to come. But I thought you should know. He may not have much time." The world tilted on its axis. His father was dying. All those years of imagined conversations, of planned confrontations, of carefully rehearsed anger, none of it mattered now. Time, the one thing he'd thought he had in abundance, was running out. Keanu stood on a Tokyo street corner as the city awakened around him, and for the first time in his adult life, he allowed himself to cry. Not the controlled emotion of a performance, but the raw, desperate grief of a son who had just learned he might lose his father before ever truly knowing him. An hour later, he was on a bullet train to Kyoto. The journey gave him time to think about all the roles he'd played over the years. Neo, searching for truth in a false reality. John Wick, driven by love and loss. Ted, spreading kindness in an unkind world. Every character, he realized now, had been a piece of his own puzzle. A man trying to understand love, loss, and redemption without having experienced the most fundamental relationship of all. As the train approached Kyoto, Keanu's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a voice message from Hiroshi. "Your father asked me to tell you something. He said that if you come today, he doesn't want apologies or explanations. He just wants to know you. He wants to hear about your life, your work, your happiness. He said he lost the right to be your father long ago, but he hopes he might earn the privilege of being your friend." When the train pulled into Kyoto Station, Keanu's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it over the ambient noise of the platform. The address led him to a small traditional house in the Arashiyama district, surrounded by bamboo groves that swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. As he approached the door, it opened before he could knock, and there, for the first time in 58 years, father and son stood face to face. What happened in that doorway would remain between them forever. But what emerged from their meeting 3 hours later was visible to anyone who knew how to look. Keanu Reeves walked out of that house a different man. The walls he'd built around his heart hadn't crumbled. They had been gently, carefully dismantled by the hands of someone who understood exactly why they'd been built in the first place. His father, frail but lucid, had spent those 3 hours not seeking forgiveness, but offering understanding. "I see now why you became an actor," his father had said, as they sat in the small garden behind the house. "You've been trying out different ways to be human, different ways to love and lose and find meaning. I robbed you of your first model for that, and you've been brilliantly improvising ever since." They talked about everything and nothing, about Keanu's motorcycle collection, his love of literature, his approach to kindness. His father shared stories of his conservation work, his path to sobriety, his quiet pride in watching his son's career from afar. When it was time to leave, his father handed him a small wooden box. "I've been carving these for you for 30 years, he said. "One for every year I've been sober. I didn't know if I'd ever get to give them to you." Inside the box were 30 small wooden figures, each one unique, each one representing a different aspect of the natural world his father worked to protect. Bears, eagles, salmon, ancient trees, and at the bottom, a note, "For my son, who taught me that redemption is possible even when forgiveness seems impossible. Thank you for becoming exactly who you were meant to be." 6 months later, Samuel Nowlin Reeves Jr. passed away peacefully in his sleep. Keanu was by his side, holding his hand as gently as his father had once held his when he was 3 years old, a memory that had returned during their time together in Kyoto. The funeral was small, private. Keanu spoke about second chances and the courage it takes to love someone despite the risk of loss. He didn't mention the wooden figures now displayed prominently in his home, or the weekly video calls they'd shared in those final months, or the way his father's laughter had filled spaces in his heart he didn't know were empty. What he did mention, in interviews afterward, was how meeting his father had changed his approach to every relationship in his life. The walls came down, the distance disappeared. He began saying yes to connections he had previously avoided. "I learned that it's never too late to know someone," he told one interviewer, "and it's never too late to let yourself be known." The photograph that had started it all remained on his bedside table, next to the wooden box. But now, instead of representing loss, it represented the profound truth that love can survive any distance, any mistake, any amount of time. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to open the door when opportunity knocks, you discover that the story you thought was ending was actually just beginning. But there's something else the world doesn't know about that day in Kyoto, something that would change not just Keanu's life, but the lives of countless others. As Keanu sat with his father in that bamboo garden, his father revealed one final secret. The conservation work, the scholarships, the decades of quiet philanthropy, it had all been funded by something unexpected. "I never stopped writing to you," his father confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Letters I never sent, poems about the son I'd lost, stories about the man I hoped you'd become. 20 years ago, I started publishing them anonymously. The royalties, they've been building up in an account with your name on it." Keanu's breath caught. His father had been a writer all along. The very thing that had drawn Keanu to storytelling through film had been inherited from the man he'd never known. "There's enough there to fund a foundation," his father continued, "for children who grow up without fathers. Not charity, connection, programs that pair them with mentors who understand what it means to build yourself from broken pieces." 6 weeks after his father's funeral, the Samuel and Keanu Reeves Foundation opened its doors. But Keanu made one crucial decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He wouldn't be a silent benefactor. For the first time in his career, Keanu Reeves became publicly emotional. At the foundation's launch, standing before a room full of single mothers and their children, he told his story, all of it, the abandonment, the pain, the reconciliation, the loss. "My father and I had 6 months together," he said, his voice breaking. "But in those 6 months, I learned that it's never too late to be the person you needed when you were young." The room was silent except for the sound of grown adults crying. That foundation now operates in 12 countries. Keanu visits personally, not as a celebrity, but as someone who understands. He sits with children who stare at doors that never open, and he tells them something his father told him in that garden. "Your story isn't defined by who left. It's defined by who you choose to become." And in those moments, surrounded by kids who are learning that abandonment doesn't equal worthlessness, Keanu finally understands what his father meant about redemption being possible even when forgiveness seems impossible. The wooden figures still sit by his bedside, but now they're joined by drawings and letters from children who no longer believe they're broken. Because sometimes the greatest gift you can give the world is the healing you needed most yourself.